Hello, everyone. I am the sleep storyteller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps out a lot. Also, let me know in the comments, where are you from and what time are you listening? Now get comfortable and relax. The night is calm. A velvet tapestry of stars stretching endlessly across the heavens, their silver glow casting a soft shimmer upon the quiet earth below. A cool breeze whispers through the trees, rustling the leaves like distant echoes of an age long past. Somewhere in the depths of a forgotten land, where time moves differently and shadows stretch beyond sight, the legends of Middle-earth stir once more. Settle in, let the weight of the day slip away, and allow the stories of fire and flight, wisdom and destruction to weave their spell upon your mind. For tonight, we journey into the ancient world of dragons, before the great kingdoms of men rose and fell, before the hobbits found their place in the quiet green hills of the Shire, before even the rings of power were forged in secret beneath the mountains, there were dragons. They were not mere beasts, not mindless creatures of flame and fury, but beings of cunning, intelligence, and immeasurable malice. Their eyes burned with a knowing fire, their words coiled like serpents in the minds of those foolish enough to listen, and their power was such that even the mightiest warriors trembled before them. They were not born of nature's design, but were creations of something darker, something older than the world itself. In the beginning, before the shaping of Middle-earth, there was Ilúvatar the One. From his thought came the Ainur, the first and greatest beings, spirits of immeasurable wisdom and power. Among them was Melkor, the mightiest of all, who longed not only to create, but to rule, to bend the world to his own will. And so, even as the Ainur wove their music to bring the world into being, Melkor's discord crept through the harmony, tainting the song with something wild and untamed. When the world took form, he descended into it, shaping it to his desire, spreading darkness where there should have been light, and corrupting all that was fair and good. It was Melkor, later named Morgoth, who first brought dragons into the world. They were not beasts of the free wilds, but weapons, crafted with deliberate malice, forged in the hidden pits of his fortress of Angband. His goal was not merely destruction, but dominion. The elves, the firstborn of Middle-earth, had risen in beauty and wisdom, crafting mighty cities and wielding powers gifted to them by the Valar, the great spirits who watched over the world. Morgoth hated them above all else. He sought to twist their works, to ruin their legacies, and to unleash upon them terrors beyond their imagining. From this hatred, he shaped the first dragon, Glorung, the father of dragons. But before we speak of him, before we trace the paths of fire that these creatures carved across the ages, breathe deeply. Imagine yourself in a quiet study, an ancient tome spread before you, its pages worn with time, its ink faded, yet still telling tales of long-lost days. A fire crackles gently in the hearth, the golden glow casting flickering shadows upon upon the walls. This is not just a story, it is history, carved into the very bones of the earth, whispered in the winds that pass over forgotten ruins. Tonight, we walk these paths together, tracing the rise of dragons from the depths of Angband to the skies above Middle-earth. Glorung was not like the dragons of later years. He had no wings to darken the skies, no vast shadow to stretch across the land. But what he lacked in flight, he made up for in sheer presence. His body was long and coiling, covered in scales harder than the strongest dwarven-forged steel, each plate glinting like molten gold in the firelight. His breath was thick with a terrible heat, not yet the inferno that later dragons would wield, but something smoldering, something suffocating. Yet his greatest weapon was not his claws, nor his breath, nor even his might. It was his mind. Glorung was not a mere creature of instinct. He was cunning, and his words could twist the hearts of even the bravest warriors. He was first unleashed upon the world in the First Age, when Morgoth sought to break the strength of the elves and their allies. The great elven strongholds of Beleriand stood firm against the Dark Lord's might, their warriors fierce, their lords wise. But Morgoth, ever patient, waited until the time was right. In the year 260 of the First Age, Glorung emerged from Angband, leading a host of orcs in a siege that shook the very foundations of the land. He was young then, not yet at the height of his power, but already he was fearsome to behold. His scales gleamed in the firelight, his eyes burned like twin embers, and when he spoke, his voice was like the grinding of stone upon stone, heavy with malice and deceit. The elves, led by the valiant Fingon, did not falter. Though they had never faced such a creature before, they did not flee. They fought with a desperate fury, their blades flashing like silver lightning against the dark tide of Morgoth's forces. And though Glorung was mighty, he was not yet invulnerable. His arrogance was his downfall. He had not yet learned the full extent of his strength, and he ventured too far too soon. Fingon and his warriors drove him back, their arrows striking at the softer places beneath his scales, their blades finding purchase in the narrow gaps of his armored hide. Wounded and enraged, Glorung was forced to retreat, slithering back into the shadows of Angband, his pride wounded as much as his flesh. But he did not forget. Dragons never forget. For years, he brooded in the darkness of Angband, growing stronger, his rage deepening, his mind sharpening. When he returned, it would not be in folly, nor in haste. When he returned, it would be with a force that would shake the very foundations of the world. And so, as the fires of war smoldered, as the elves caught their breath and tended to their wounded, they knew one terrible truth. Glorung had been driven back, but he had not been defeated. His time would come, his fire would rise, and the world would burn. The years passed, and the world held its breath. The elves of Beleriand had driven Glorung back into the shadows, but they knew it was not victory, only a moment of respite. Deep within the black halls of Angband, Morgoth nursed his wounded creation, shaping him into something greater, something more terrible. The dragon that had once slithered, young and reckless, through the fields of battle now grew into a force, unlike anything the world had seen. The First Age was an age of heroes, but it was also an age of shadows, and from those shadows, Glorung would rise again. When he emerged from Angband once more, it was not as an impatient youth, but as a true terror of the battlefield. His body had grown massive, his scales harder than ever, gleaming like polished iron in the firelight. The fire in his breath had intensified, no longer a mere smoldering heat, but a consuming blaze, capable of reducing the greatest fortresses to ruin. And his mind, always sharp, had become even more dangerous. If before he was a weapon of war, now he was a master of it. His voice alone could bend wills. His gaze could strip away courage, and his presence could break the resolve of even the bravest warriors. And so, in the year 455 of the First Age, Morgoth unleashed his war upon the world, the dagger Bragalach, the battle of sudden flame. Fire erupted from the depths of the earth, searing across the plains of Ardgalen, reducing the green fields to a wasteland of ash and ruin. The forces of Morgoth surged forth, orcs pouring from Angband in a black tide, Balrogs wreathed in shadow, and flame leading the charge. And at the heart of it all was Glorung, the father of dragons, a living tempest of destruction. His return was like the awakening of a nightmare long thought buried. He led the assault with terrifying precision, his fire carving paths of ruin through the once fertile lands. The elves, so long steadfast against the darkness, now found themselves on the defensive, their strongholds falling one by one before the might of Morgoth's onslaught. Glorung crushed battalions beneath his coiling form, his breath melting armor and turning swords to useless slag. But it was not merely his strength that brought devastation. It was his mind, his voice, his terrible power of deception. It was said that to meet Glorung's gaze was to lose oneself, to be stripped of hope and will, to be ensnared in the twisting webs of his words. He was no mindless beast. He was a creature of malice and manipulation, a being who relished not just in destruction, but in despair. His words were poison, his promises laced with ruin, and those who dared to listen found their minds unraveling like thread pulled from a fraying tapestry. As the battle raged, the great northern strongholds of the elves, Fingolfin's realm of Hithlum, the mountain defenses of the sons of Fëanor, were set upon with unrelenting force. Even the mighty fortress of Himring, held by the valiant Midros, found itself besieged, the fires of Glorung licking at its walls. It was a war unlike any before it, and it would mark the beginning of the end for the free peoples of Beleriand. But amidst the ruin and chaos, there were those who did not yield. Fingolfin, High King of the Noldor, saw the devastation wrought by Glorung and Morgoth's forces, and he knew that the tide was turning against his people. Wrath filled his heart, and in his fury, he did the unthinkable. Alone, he rode to the gates of Angband, challenging Morgoth himself to single combat. It was was a battle sung of in legend, a duel between the mightiest of elven kings and the Dark Lord, who had brought so much ruin upon the world. Though Fingolfin fought with unmatched skill, wounding Morgoth 7 times, the Dark Lord proved too great an adversary. The elven king fell, crushed beneath Morgoth's blackened blade, and with his fall, the light of resistance grew dimmer. Glorung reveled in the despair that followed. The battle had shattered the strength of the elves, and the balance of power had shifted. The lands of the north were lost, overrun by Morgoth's forces, and the great siege that had once held Angband at bay was broken. The dragon's fire had done its work well, and now he coiled within the ruins, his belly resting upon the charred remains of the free lands, his hunger for destruction still unquenched. But the story of Glorung was far from over. His greatest act of malice had yet to come, for though he was a weapon of war, he was also a master of deception. And the cruelest games he played were not on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of men. And so, as the First Age wove its tale of fire and sorrow, Glorung turned his gaze toward a new target, one whose fate would be intertwined with his own in a dance of tragedy. One whose name would be spoken in sorrow for all the ages to come, Turin Turambar, the tale of a cursed warrior, and a dragon whose words could shatter souls was about to unfold, and the world would never be the same again. The shadow of Morgoth stretched across Beleriand, and with it, the influence of Glorung grew. The war had left the lands broken, and though the elves still held pockets of resistance, the tide had turned. Morgoth, ever watchful, sought not only to conquer through strength, but to unravel the spirits of his enemies. It was not enough for them to die, they had to despair. And for such a task, there was no greater instrument than Glorung. His fire could reduce cities to ruin, but his words could turn even the noblest of hearts against themselves. Far to the south, beyond the rivers and hills that still clung to the remnants of peace, a child was born into this world of sorrow. His name was Turin, son of Hurin, a man of great valor and renown. But Turin's fate was not to be one of glory. From the moment of his birth, a doom lay upon him, one cast by Morgoth himself. For Hurin, his father, had defied the Dark Lord, had stood unyielding in the face of his might. And for this, Morgoth's vengeance was bound to his bloodline. Hurin was taken captive, bound in chains to watch, as his family was tormented by the cruel twists of fate. And so, Turin's life was set upon a path of suffering, a path that would eventually lead him into the waiting coils of Glorung. Turin grew into a mighty warrior, skilled in battle, his heart hardened by grief. He wandered from place to place, seeking purpose, seeking to escape the doom that followed him like a shadow. He fought with elves, stood among outlaws, and carved a name for himself in blood and defiance. Yet no matter where he went, tragedy seemed to follow, as though the curse of Morgoth clung to him like an unseen chain. And then, at last, the fateful encounter came. The great ruined fortress of Nargothrond, once a proud elven kingdom, had fallen under the onslaught of Morgoth's forces. Turin had been among those who fought to defend it, but it was not orcs alone who led the assault. Glorung had come, his fire sweeping through the halls, his voice echoing in the corridors, and before his might, the proud defenses of Nargothrond crumbled like sand before a storm. Turin stood upon the broken bridge of the city as the dragon loomed before him, vast and terrible, his golden eyes burning like twin suns. The ground trembled beneath his weight, and the air was thick with the stench of fire and ruin. But it was not the dragon's claws that struck first, nor his fire, it was his words. Son of Hurin, Glorung's voice was like the grinding of mountains, deep and laden with malice. Long have I watched you. Long have you wandered, seeking to escape your fate. But there is no escape, no road that leads away from the doom that follows you. Do you not see? You are cursed, Turin, and all who love you will suffer because of you. Turin, who had stood against countless foes, found himself frozen. There was power in the dragon's gaze, a force that burrowed deep into his mind, clouding it with doubt and despair. He had always feared the curse that haunted him, had always wondered if his misfortunes were of his own making. And now, with the dragon's words wrapped around his thoughts like a vice, he could not look away. Your mother and sister still live, abandoned, forgotten, Glorung whispered. While you play at being a hero, they suffer. They wait for you, but you will never find them, for you have strayed too far. And when they perish, it will be because of you, as all things you touch are doomed to perish. Turin's hands clenched around the hilt of his sword, but his arms would not move. His breath came ragged, his vision swam. The dragon's words dripped into his soul like poison, and before them, all his strength melted away. And then, with cruel finality, Glorung spoke once more. Go now, Turin. Run from this place. Run from your past, from your deeds, from the truth. Seek your kin if you think you can find them. But remember, wherever you go, your shadow follows. And Turin obeyed. With his mind clouded, his will bent to the dragon's malice. He turned from the battlefield and fled. He did not stay to avenge the fallen of Nargothrond, nor to strike down the beast that had spoken such ruin into his heart. He ran, and behind him, Glorung laughed, his great body coiled around the ruins he had claimed. For Glorung knew that wounds of the mind were far crueler than wounds of the flesh. The blade of despair would cut deeper than any sword, and with his words alone, he had ensured that Turin's path would only lead to greater suffering. The dragon had set the next act of the tragedy into motion, and far away, in lands yet untouched by fire, doom waited with patient, unseen hands. Turin fled from Nargothrond, his mind shrouded in the dark fog of Glorung's deception. He did not stop to think, did not question why he ran, only that he must. The dragon's words clung to him like chains. Each step weighted with a growing despair. He had been told that his mother and sister still lived, suffering in the world beyond. And so, he abandoned the ruin of Nargothrond to seek them, never knowing that with every hurried step, he was walking deeper into the snare that had been laid for him. Behind him, Glorung lay coiled upon the wreckage of the fallen kingdom, his golden eyes gleaming with wicked satisfaction. He had no need to strike Turin down in battle, no need for fire or claws. The boy had been broken with nothing but whispers, and that, to the father of dragons, was the sweetest victory of all. Turin wandered for many days, his journey a haze of fevered thoughts and restless steps. His path led him south, where the forests grew dense and wild, where rivers carved deep into the land like veins of silver. He did not know where he was going, only that he had to keep moving. The weight of his past hung upon him, growing heavier with each passing mile. And then, at last, he came upon a small village nestled between the hills and trees. He did not know its name, nor did he care. He was weary, his mind lost in the words Glorung had woven around him. But fate is cruel, and as he stepped among the quiet homes and simple folk, he came upon a woman with long dark hair and sorrowful eyes that, had he not been blinded by the dragon's enchantment, he would have recognized at once. Her name was Niner, his sister, but Glorung's spell had stolen her past from her. She did not remember her name, nor her family, nor the home she had once known. She was a shadow with no memory, a soul adrift in the vastness of the world. And Turin, who had been made blind to the truth, did not recognize her either. He saw only a woman lost, much like himself, and in their shared sorrow, they clung to one another, two wayward souls caught in the same storm. Time passed, and in the quiet solitude of the forest, Turin and Niner found a fleeting happiness, though it was built upon the cruel foundation of ignorance. They did not know that their joy was a thing shaped by the malice of a dragon's tongue, nor did they realize that their love was a thread pulled from the great tapestry of Morgoth's curse. But shadows do not remain still for long. One night, the earth trembled. A distant roar split the air, a sound so deep and terrible that even the trees seemed to shudder. A black wind swept through the land, thick with the scent of fire and ruin. Glorung was coming. The people of the village scattered in fear. Some fled into the hills, others into the depths of the forests. But Turin did not run. He had spent too long in the grip of despair, too long under the weight of fate's cruelty. Now, as the father of dragons came to claim this land, he would not flee. He would fight with his black sword, Gurthang, in hand. Turin stood at the edge of the forest, watching as the horizon burned with the coming of the beast. His heart thundered in his chest, not with fear, but with rage. He had been deceived, manipulated, and brought low, but no longer. Tonight, the dragon would fall. And so, as the shadow of Glorung stretched across the land, Turin prepared for his final battle. The fate of a cursed warrior and a dragon of ancient malice was about to be decided, and the night would end in blood and ruin. The ground trembled beneath Turin's feet as the air thickened with smoke and heat. The dragon's presence was a storm upon the land, a force of ruin that seemed to swallow the very light of the stars above. Glorung moved slowly, his great form slithering across the hills, his golden scales reflecting the fire that smoldered in his breath. His eyes, burning embers of malice, fixed upon Turin with amusement. "So, son of Hurin," Glorung's voice rumbled like distant thunder, "you have come to face me at last. But tell me, do you fight for vengeance, or do you still believe in hope?" Turin did not answer. His grip tightened upon Gurthang, the black blade that had drunk the blood of many foes, but none so great as the beast before him. His heart was heavy with the weight of every sorrow that had led him here, every loss, every deception. He had been a pawn in the hands of fate, but now he would forge his own end. Glorung chuckled, a deep and terrible sound. "You are ever the stubborn one," he mused. "Yet you remain blind. Do you not see the chains of your doom? You have followed my whispers, wandered into the path I have set, and even now you stand upon the precipice of despair." Turin's body burned with fury, but he knew better than to meet the dragon's gaze. He had felt its power once before, had been caught in its web, but not again. No more. This was not a battle of words. It was a reckoning of steel and fire. Without another breath, Turin struck. He lunged forward, Gurthang flashing in the dim light, its dark edge seeking the dragon's flesh. Glorung reared back, his laughter turning into a roar, as Turin's blade scraped against the iron-hard scales, failing to pierce the armored hide. The dragon's tail lashed out, and Turin barely leapt aside as the ground cracked beneath the force of the impact. "You think yourself a slayer of dragons," Glorung sneered, his massive body shifting with unnerving grace. "You are but a fly upon the wind, son of Hurin, a fleeting spark before the coming darkness." Did not listen. He circled the beast, his mind racing. He could not match Glorung's sheer strength, nor could he shatter the enchanted armor of his scales. But every monster, no matter how great, had its weakness. He thought of Smog and Tales yet to come, the fatal flaw that had been revealed to a clever thief. He thought of dragons brought low not by force, but by precision. And then he saw it, the underbelly, the place where the scales thinned, where the flesh beneath was vulnerable. But to strike there, he would need to wait, to endure, to make Glorung believe himself untouchable. Turin feigned retreat, stepping back into the shadows of the trees. Glorung slithered forward, his vast body crushing the earth beneath him, his breath filling the air with searing heat. "Run if you wish," the dragon taunted. "It will not change what you are. You are doomed, Turin, and no blade can sever the chains Morgoth has laid upon you." Turin said nothing. He waited. He let the dragon come closer, let his arrogance swell, let him believe in his own invincibility. And then, with a burst of speed, Turin dove beneath the beast as Glorung reared up. Gurthang found its mark, the black blade, sharp as sorrow, and fated for ruin, plunged deep into the dragon underbelly. A sound like breaking thunder filled the night as the weapon tore through scale and sinew, sinking to the very hilt. Glorung roared, a cry that shattered the air, that sent birds fleeing from distant trees, that that seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. His body convulsed, his tail lashing wildly, and Turin barely escaped being crushed beneath the thrashing weight of the dying beast. The dragon twisted, his golden eyes now dark with agony, his breath faltering. He turned his gaze upon Turin one final time, and though his body failed, his voice did not. "You think yourself victorious," Glorung whispered, his words slow, venomous. "But even in death, I am your doom." Turin's breath came fast, his heart pounding, his sword still buried in the dragon's flesh. He should have turned away, should have let the beast die in silence, but something in Glorung's voice held him there. And then, in the dragon's final breath, the last of his strength flowed into a single, terrible revelation. "Look upon her," Glorung hissed. "Look and see the truth of what I have wrought." Turin turned, and there, lying upon the earth, pale and trembling, was Niner. The spell was broken. Her memory had returned, and with it came the knowledge of who she truly was, sister. Turin staggered back, his mind unraveling, his world collapsing upon itself. His hands shook, his breath caught in his throat. No, no, it could not be. But the truth stood before him, undeniable, unbearable. Glorung exhaled a final breath, his great head falling to the ground, his golden eyes fading into darkness. The dragon was dead, but his victory was complete. Turin's scream split the night, raw with horror, with fury, with grief so vast it could drown the stars. And as he fell to his knees beside Niner, the weight of his fate at last became too much to bear. The dragon had been slain, but Turambar had already been destroyed. The night was silent, yet the weight of Glorung's final words lingered like a specter in the air. The dragon's body lay still, its golden scales dulling in death, its breath no longer filling the sky with heat and smoke. But the ruin he had left behind was far greater than the destruction of the land. He had shattered a soul. Turin stood motionless, his mind drowning in the horror of realization. Niner, his beloved, his wife, was his sister. The knowledge twisted inside him like a blade, cruel and merciless. Niner's face was pale beneath the moonlight, her body trembling as the memories stolen from her by Glorung's spell came flooding back. She gasped, clutching her head, eyes wide with an anguish that no words could contain. "No," she whispered, "it cannot be." But the truth was undeniable. The dragon's curse had been lifted, and in its place, only ruin remained. She turned her gaze to Turin, and he saw in her eyes not anger, not accusation, only sorrow. A sorrow so deep, so boundless, that it mirrored his own. The world seemed to shrink around them, the stars above distant and cold, as if even the heavens could not bear to witness their grief. Turin staggered back, his breath ragged. The black sword, Gurthang, still dripped with the blood of the slain dragon, but it felt meaningless now, a hollow victory. "Glorung is dead," he murmured, as if saying it aloud would somehow lessen the weight upon his heart. But the dragon's shadow still loomed over them, not in flesh, but in fate. Niner took a step away from him, her hands shaking. "We have been deceived," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "All of it, our love, our happiness, it was all a lie, woven by that cursed beast." Turin reached for her, desperation in his eyes, but she recoiled. Not in hatred, not in blame, but in despair too great to endure. "I cannot bear it," she wept. "I cannot live with this truth." And before Turin could stop her, before he could find the words to call her back, Nina turned and ran. She fled through the trees, her dark hair streaming behind her like a shadow against the moonlit sky. He called her name, but she did not stop. The river lay ahead, its waters dark and deep, and Nina, blinded by grief, did not hesitate. She cast herself from the cliffs, her final cry swallowed by the night, and was lost beneath the rushing waves. Turin fell to his knees, the world around him crumbling into nothingness. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands clawing at the earth as if he could hold onto something, anything, that would anchor him to reality. But there was nothing. Only silence, only loss. For a long time, he did not move. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the sorrow of men, and the dragon's corpse lay still beside him, its empty eyes gazing into the void. Then slowly, Turin rose. His face was empty of expression, his eyes dark with something deeper than grief, finality. He lifted Gurthang, the black blade that had served him through countless battles, and held it before him. "Hail, Gurthang," he whispered, his voice hollow. "Will you take my life as you have taken so many before?" The blade gleamed, its dark steel whispering in the wind, as if answering the call of its master. Turin set the hilt against the earth and placed the tip against his heart. With one last breath, he let himself fall. The blade bit deep, and the son of Hurin knew no more. And so, the tale of Turin Turambar came to an end, not by the hand of fate alone, but by the cruel machinations of a dragon long dead. Glorung had perished, yet his victory was absolute. His fire had faded, but the ruin he had sown would echo through the ages, a tragedy written in blood and sorrow. Far away, beyond the shadowed lands, Morgoth watched from his dark throne and smiled. The world moved on, but the echoes of Turin's fate lingered, whispered by the winds that swept over the graves of lost kingdoms. Glorung was dead, but the fire of dragons had not been extinguished. Deep in the dark places of the world, in the hidden pits where Morgoth's influence still festered, greater horrors were taking shape. The First Age neared its end, and with it came a final reckoning. The War of Wrath had begun. The valor, the mighty powers who had once shaped the world, could no longer remain distant. They gathered their armies, and with them came the host of the Eldar, the elves who had long suffered under Morgoth's dominion. From the west, their ships filled the horizon, and from them poured warriors clad in silver and gold, their blades shining like starlight against the gathering darkness. The last great war against the Dark Lord had come, and all of Middle-earth trembled beneath its weight. Morgoth, ever cunning, had foreseen this battle. He had prepared for it, gathering his strongest forces, summoning his most fearsome creations. The orcs surged from their pits, the Balrogs unfurled their burning whips, and in the heart of Angband, deep within the mountains, blackened by ancient sorcery, a new horror took flight. The winged dragons had awakened. Unlike Glorung, who had crawled upon the earth like a great serpent, these beasts were forged for the skies. Their wings spread wide, blotting out the sun. Their voices thundered across the battlefield, and their fire burned hotter than any forge. They were Morgoth's last and greatest weapons, creatures of destruction unleashed upon the world in his final, desperate bid for victory. And at their head was Ankalagan the Black. No dragon before him, nor any after, would match his size or his fury. His wings stretched like storm clouds across the sky. His breath was a furnace that could melt mountains, and his roar shook the very bones of the earth. He led the host of winged dragons into battle, descending upon the forces of the Valor like a tempest of flame and death. For a moment, the tide of the war shifted. The warriors of light, so certain of their victory, faltered beneath the onslaught of Morgoth's greatest beast. The sky itself seemed to burn as Ankalagan, and his kin laid waste to all in their path, their fire turning the heavens to an inferno, their claws raking across the land, leaving ruin in their wake. But there was one who would not yield. Eärendil the Mariner, half-elven, blessed by the light of the Silmaril, took to the skies aboard his great ship, Vingalot. It was no mere vessel of wood and sail. It was a ship of legend, carried by the winds of the Valor, its prow gleaming like a star upon the darkened sky. And at its helm, Eärendil bore the light of the Silmaril upon his brow, a radiance that no shadow could withstand. The battle that followed would be sung of for all the ages of the world. Eärendil and Ankalagan clashed above the mountains of Thangorodrim, their struggle lighting the sky with fire and fury. The dragon's breath scorched the heavens. His wings tore through the clouds like a storm given form. But Eärendil did not falter. He wove through the fire, his ship moving like a streak of light against the abyss. For a full day and night, they fought, the dragon and the mariner, locked in a battle that would shape the fate of Middle-earth. Ankalagan's fury was boundless, but Eärendil fought with the fire of the Silmaril, with the strength of all those who had suffered beneath Morgoth's shadow. His arrows, forged by the elves, found their mark, piercing even the thickest of the dragon's blackened scales. And then, at last, with one final fateful strike, Eärendil loosed an arrow that flew straight and true, sinking deep into Ankalagan's heart. The great beast reared back, his roar of agony shaking the world. And then, with wings failing, he fell. The earth itself seemed to shudder as Ankalagan, the Black, plummeted from the heavens, his vast form striking the peaks of Thangorodrim with such force that the mountains themselves crumbled beneath him. The dark spires of Morgoth's fortress shattered, broken beneath the weight of his own creation. The skies cleared, the fire dimmed, and the mightiest dragon to ever live was no more. With Ankalagan's fall, the tide of war turned. Morgoth's armies, once unbreakable, now scattered. The valor pressed forward, their wrath unstoppable, and at last the Dark Lord was overthrown. He was captured, his crown shattered, his power stripped from him, and he was cast beyond the world into the void, never to return. The First Age ended in fire and ruin, and though victory was won, the scars it left upon Middle-earth would never fade. The dragons that remained, scattered and broken, fled into the farthest reaches of the world. Some hid in the deepest caverns, others slumbered beneath forgotten mountains, waiting for the day when they might rise again. The winged terrors of Morgoth were no more, but their kind was not yet lost to time. For though the First Age had ended, Middle-earth would know dragons again, and in the ages to come, there would rise another, a dragon who would claim a mountain, a hoard of gold, and a tale that would be remembered forever. But that is a story yet to be told. The First Age had ended in fire and ruin, but the echoes of its battles lingered across Middle-earth. The dragons that had once served Morgoth were scattered, their numbers diminished, their master cast into the void. Yet evil does not die so easily, nor do the shadows that once darkened the land vanish without leaving traces behind. In the deep places of the world, where the light of the sun never reached, remnants of the dragonkind still lurked. They did not march in great wars, nor did they sweep across the sky in legions, but they endured, waiting, watching. The Second Age dawned, an age of rebuilding, of rising kingdoms and new powers shaping the world. The elves, though wounded by the scars of the past, built mighty realms once more, Lindon, Eregion, and beneath the stars, the hidden valley of Rivendell. Men, too, found their place in this new world, the Númenóreans carving their empire upon the seas, their ships sailing to distant shores. The world, for a time, seemed to breathe again. But evil does not sleep, it only slumbers, and in its quiet patience, it grows ever more dangerous. While the dragons of old had dwindled, some still remained in the farthest reaches of Middle-earth. They were lesser in number, but not in cunning. Among them were the cold drakes, beasts that did not breathe fire, but whose strength and malice rivaled that of their fiery kin. They prowled the frozen wastes of the north, far beyond the sight of elves and men, nesting in the jagged peaks and dark caverns of Forodwaith. Few dared to tread those lands, for the ice itself seemed alive with menace, and the whispers of travelers spoke of glowing eyes watching from the shadows. For many centuries, these creatures kept to their desolate domains, far removed from the affairs of Middle-earth. But there was one place where dragons still stirred, where their presence would once again shape the fate of kings and warriors. The gray mountains, long, cold, and vast, became home to a new generation of drakes. There, deep in the halls of stone, where dwarves mined for treasure untold, a darkness crept once more. The dwarves, ever seekers of wealth, had prospered after the fall of Morgoth. Their realms stretched across the mountains. Their forges burned bright with the crafting of weapons, jewels, and golden treasures. And as always, where wealth gathered, dragons took notice. It began with whispers, rumors of strange movements in the high passes, of shadows that seemed too large to be wolves. Then, one by one, the dwarven halls of the gray mountains fell silent. No armies marched against them. No orc hordes came with fire and blade. Instead, there was only the beating of wings in the night, the slow, patient hunger of creatures that had learned from their fallen kin. These dragons did not come in great wars as Ankalagan had. They did not challenge the might of the Valor or seek dominion over all lands. They came as hunters, as predators of hordes, creeping into the great halls of the dwarves and claiming them for their own. The dwarves fought bravely, as they always had. They wielded their axes, their armor gleamed in the firelight, and their hammers rang against the stone. But dragons were not foes easily slain. Their scales turned aside blades, their claws crushed stone as if it were paper, and their cunning was greater than any beast's. The dwarves, for all their skill, could not stand against the slow and methodical ruin that came upon them. Kingdoms were lost. The halls of gold were emptied, their riches now lying beneath the great bodies of slumbering drakes. The dwarves who survived fled to distant lands, their numbers scattering like embers upon the wind. Some journeyed south to the Iron Hills, to Erebor, to lands where the shadow of dragons had not yet reached. But they did not forget. The memory of their stolen halls, their lost treasures, burned in their hearts like embers waiting to be rekindled. Yet the world did not see these events as omens. The rise of Sauron in the Second Age, the forging of the Rings of Power, the wars between elves and men, these were the great tales of the time. The silent conquest of the Grey Mountains was but a whisper in the storm. But the dragons had not vanished. They had learned patience, and they had learned that the greatest treasures in the world were not found in the frozen wastes, nor in forgotten halls of ruin. There was a place richer than any other. A mountain filled with gold, standing alone in the vastness of the land. And one dragon, above all, would seek to claim it. His name would be spoken in fear, and the world would remember Smaug the Golden. The third age of Middle-earth dawned, an age of shifting powers and rising kingdoms, where the echoes of the past still lingered in the dark corners of the world. The shadow of Sauron, long thought banished, began to stir once more in the hidden places of Middle-earth. Yet, as the free peoples turned their eyes toward this growing menace, they did not see the danger that loomed in the north, where fire still burned in the hearts of dragons. The Grey Mountains remained a land of peril, where the remnants of dragonkind had made their home. Cold drakes prowled the frozen peaks, preying upon any who dared venture too far into the wild. The dwarves, weary of their old enemies, still dreamed of reclaiming their lost halls, but they knew the cost of such ambition. They had suffered too greatly under the talons of these beasts to take their return lightly. But it was not the Grey Mountains that would soon become the center of dragon lore. Far to the east, beyond the great greenwood, stood a lonely peak, a mountain of legend, a kingdom carved from the stone itself. Erebor, the lonely mountain, was the jewel of Durin's folk, the heart of dwarven might and craftsmanship. Within its halls, rivers of gold flowed, its forges burned bright, and its treasure hoards grew vast beyond measure. It was a kingdom of unmatched wealth, and where there was wealth, a dragon would come. The whispers of Erebor's riches spread through the lands, carried by merchants and wanderers, by travelers and traders who spoke of the dwarves' growing power. Somewhere in the hidden reaches of the world, one pair of eyes burned with hunger at these tales. Smaug, last of the great dragons of Middle-earth, stirred from his long slumber. Unlike the beasts of Morgoth's time, Smaug was not a servant of darkness, not a weapon of war forged for the conquest of the world. He had no master, no allegiance to any dark lord or kingdom of shadow. He was, in his own right, a king of destruction, ruled only by his own greed, his own insatiable desire to possess. He did not seek dominion over lands or races. He sought only gold. And so, one night, beneath a sky black as ink, Smaug took flight. The dwarves of Erebor had grown comfortable in their wealth, secure in the belief that no enemy could threaten their halls. They did not hear the beating of wings until it was too late. From the darkness above, a shadow descended, vast and terrible, fire gleaming upon golden scales. The mountain, once a place of song and laughter, was drowned in flame. Smaug's wrath was swift and absolute. His fire turned stone to molten ruin. His claws tore through the great gates of Erebor as if they were parchment. The dwarves, for all their strength, could do nothing against him. They fell beneath his fury, their axes shattering upon his impenetrable hide, their arrows breaking like twigs against his scales. King Thror, the ruler of Erebor, could do nothing but watch as his kingdom burned, as the horde of his people was claimed by a monster greater than any he had ever known. The survivors fled. They streamed from the mountain like ants before the tide, seeking refuge in the wild, in the lands of men, in the lonely halls of distant kin. The once mighty kingdom of Erebor was no more, and Smaug, victorious, curled himself atop his golden throne. He did not rule as a tyrant, did not seek to command armies or enslave races. He simply remained, a dragon upon a horde, his hunger satisfied not by food or conquest, but by the sheer pleasure of possession. He slept upon mountains of gold, his breath stirring the coins like whispers in the dark. For years, for decades, for centuries, he lay within the mountain, his fire dimming but never dying, his presence a shadow over the lands. The men of Dale, the once thriving town that had stood in Erebor's shadow, lived in fear of him, their lives shaped by the knowledge that should he wake, their doom would follow. But dragons do not dream forever, and one day, a small company of travelers would come knocking at his door. A thief, a wizard, and 13 dwarves would set into motion a tale that would shake the very foundations of Middle-earth. For though Smaug was mighty, all dragons have a weakness, and his time was running out. Years passed, and Smaug's dominion over Erebor remained unchallenged. The lonely mountain stood as a monument to his greed, its halls echoing only with the slow shifting of gold beneath the dragon's vast body. No dwarf had set foot in those halls since the day of fire and ruin. No king sat upon the stone throne of Durin's line. The world beyond moved forward, yet Erebor remained frozen in time, a place of silent wealth and sleeping death. But far away, in a quiet land where the troubles of kings and dragons seemed like distant legends, a single knock upon a round green door would set the fate of Smaug into motion. The wizard Gandalf had seen the growing darkness in Middle-earth, had sensed that the great powers of the world were stirring once more. He knew that the dragon, mighty though he was, could not be left to slumber forever. For if Smaug's fire were ever turned to Sauron's will, the free peoples would know despair unlike any they had faced before. The dragon had to be removed, not just for the sake of the dwarves who had lost their home, but for the balance of the world itself. And so he set his plans in motion. Thorin Oakenshield, heir to the lost kingdom of Erebor, had never forgotten the day he had been forced to flee from his home, the day he had watched Smaug claim his people's greatest treasure. In exile, he had wandered the lands of Middle-earth, carrying the weight of his father's and grandfather's failures upon his shoulders. But now, at Gandalf's urging, he would return, not alone, but with a company of 12 dwarves and one very unexpected companion. Bilbo Baggins, a quiet hobbit of the Shire, had never sought adventure. His days were spent in comfort, in the warmth of his home, with books and tea, and meals taken at precisely the right time. Yet fate does not ask permission before it calls upon the unlikeliest of heroes. And so it was that Bilbo found himself setting out on a journey beyond anything he could have imagined, toward a mountain he had never seen, to face a dragon he had never dared to dream of, through forests and rivers, across the misty peaks and darkened roads. The company traveled, their goal ever in sight, Erebor, the stolen kingdom of the dwarves, and the treasure that lay beneath the dragon's sleeping form. But to reclaim their home, they would need more than axes and courage. They would need cunning, for dragons are not slain by force alone. When at last they reached the mountain, standing upon the threshold of the lost kingdom, it was Bilbo who was chosen to enter first. The thief, the burglar, the one small enough to slip past the sleeping beast unnoticed. With nothing but his wits, a trembling heart, and a single magic ring that could turn him invisible, he crept into the depths of Smaug's lair, and there he saw it. The dragon lay coiled upon his hoard, a sea of gold and jewels spilling out beneath him. His body shimmered in the dim light, each scale a polished plate of red and gold, as if he himself had been forged from the very treasure he guarded. His breath, slow and deep, sent waves of heat through the cavern, stirring the coins beneath him like shifting sands. His wings, vast even when folded, twitched in his sleep, as if he dreamed of fire and flight. Bilbo had never seen anything so terrible, or so magnificent. He moved carefully, his feet barely making a sound as he stepped across the mounds of treasure. His hands trembled as he reached out, taking the first small piece of gold, proof that he had been there, that he had entered the lair of the beast and lived to tell the tale. But dragons, even in slumber, are not so easily deceived. Smaug stirred. A golden eye, slit-pupiled and vast as a shield, snapped open, gleaming like molten fire. And in that moment, Bilbo Baggins knew what it was to be truly afraid. The cavern seemed to shrink around Bilbo as the golden eye fixed upon him. Smaug's breath filled the air, thick with heat, heavy with the scent of fire waiting to be unleashed. The great dragon uncoiled, his immense form shifting, sending cascades of gold tumbling like waves upon the cavern floor. His voice, deep and smooth as molten metal, filled the darkness. Well, well, Smaug purred, his words dripping with amusement. What do we have here? A thief in the shadows, creeping where he ought not to tread. His great head lowered, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. But you are no dwarf. No, you smell of earth and green things, of comfort and cowardice. Tell me, little thief, what are you? Bilbo, heart hammering in his chest, gripped the magic ring upon his finger, his form hidden from sight. But invisibility alone would not save him. He knew dragons, knew their cunning, their cruel delight in games of wit and words. If he were to survive this, he would need more than stealth. He would need cleverness. Gathering his courage, he spoke, careful to keep his voice steady. I am but a traveler, O Smaug the Magnificent, come to gaze upon your splendor. He bowed, though the dragon could not see him. For who in all Middle-earth has ever beheld such majesty and lived to speak of it? Smaug chuckled, a sound like rolling thunder. A smooth tongue for a thief, he mused, shifting his great bulk. And flattery, though well-spoken, will not spare you from my wrath. You seek to steal from me, do you not? Like the dwarves before you, like the wretched men of Dale who once grew fat upon my mountain's wealth. He stretched his wings slightly, sending a rush of air through the cavern. But I am Smaug. My claws are spears, my teeth swords. My breath is death. Bilbo swallowed, but he did not falter. And yet, O Smaug the Mighty, even the greatest treasures have flaws. Even the most magnificent beings have their weaknesses. He spoke carefully, weaving his words like a net. For surely, in all your wisdom, you are invincible. No blade could pierce your hide, no arrow find its mark. The dragon's eyes narrowed. Indeed, Smaug said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. No blade has ever harmed me, nor will it. My hide is armor, stronger than the finest steel. Look upon me and despair, for I am death incarnate. And in that moment, he made his mistake. With the arrogance of one who has never known fear, Smaug stretched his vast body, shifting to reveal the golden expanse of his underbelly, an impenetrable fortress of treasure-hardened scales. But as the dragon moved, Bilbo's sharp eyes caught something, a small patch near his left breast, bare and unprotected. A single weakness upon a mountain of impenetrable flesh. His breath caught in his throat. This was the key. This was how a dragon could fall. But he could not linger. Smaug's amusement had begun to fade, suspicion creeping into his gaze. "You have the scent of something strange upon you, thief," the dragon murmured. "Something unseen, something I do not trust. You have been sent here, haven't you?" "By whom?" Bilbo took a careful step back, feeling the weight of the ring upon his finger, knowing his time had run out. "Sent," he said quickly, forcing a laugh. "I serve no one but myself, O Smaug. And now I shall take my leave before your mighty temper decides otherwise." And with that, he turned and ran. Smaug roared, the force of his anger shaking the very walls of the mountain. A great wave of heat rushed after Bilbo as the dragon's fire erupted, chasing the small thief through the winding tunnels. But Bilbo was quick, and the ring upon his finger kept him unseen. He slipped into the darkness, barely escaping with his life, his heart racing with what he had learned. The dragon had a weakness, and somewhere beyond the mountain, in the ruins of a town that had long feared the wrath of Smaug, there was a man with a black arrow, waiting for the chance